What does the role mean to me now? I think it's shifted because I now have a small team under me. I now have a recruiter that's taken off a lot of the recruiting off my plate, thankfully. Because I think this time last year, I was doing everything, but I felt like I was dropping the ball because I wasn't doing everything well enough. And I knew there was so much we had to do internally because we were growing, at an inflection point internally where our managers were going, hang on a minute, we actually need some support as well in terms of how to hire, how do we look at performance. So I think that's what the role means to me now. I still oversee the talent strategy on the talent acquisition side, but I don't do much on the day-to-day recruiting. And a lot of my role now is learning about the internal teams, how can we support them, and most importantly for me is now retention, because we spent the last 3 years on recruiting them. The next thing is actually how do we keep them?
Hello and welcome to the Plum Pod, where we talk about all things HR and mental health. I'm your host, Georgia, and founder of Access HR. On today's episode, I'm joined by Christine Ung as we discuss the rise of talent acquisition and HR as united functions. Christine shares more on her journey, lessons, and tips when building a seamless employee experience, all based on her role as the head of talent and people at a fast-growing organization. Christine, hi.
Hi, afternoon.
Afternoon. Thank you for joining me on today's episode.
Really lovely to see you, and thanks for having me. I've never been to this side of the pond before, so yeah, it's amazing, this side.
I'm very grateful as well
Yeah.
for the studio that we're in.
Yeah.
And I really want to get into your background, more about you, in particular because of where you are now in your career and your title. I think it's going to be really inspiring for a lot of our listeners. And before I give too much away, let's set the scene. And a question that I really love to ask every guest is, was HR part of the plan, or did this happen by chance?
You know what? That's a really funny story. So I graduated in 2009. So for anyone that is old enough to remember, it was when the financial crisis happened. And I studied psychology actually here in the UK. I'm originally from Hong Kong, context. And when 2009 happened, I was looking for jobs. I'm like, what do I do with a psychology degree, right? And I applied for everything from, to be a marketing assistant, all the way to wanting to actually be a fully fledged psychologist, which I didn't realize would have taken me another 6 years. And I thought, people, business, what could it be? HR. And I ended up back in Hong Kong. I did a few roles here and there. So I was an executive assistant in a few banks. And actually at the time, I saw where HR worked, and the bank I worked for was an American bank, and we were all on the same floor, and HR was separately in a different office, 3 floors above everyone else. So I remember thinking, this is very strange. Like, if you're meant to be human resources and working with the people, why are they sat like 3 different floors away from everyone else? And I remember speaking to them and asking them whether, how, if I wanted to pursue this career, how should I do it? And I remember them kind of telling me at the time, Christine, you need to already just be doing it in order to fully, in order to get experience doing it, you should just be doing it already. And bearing in mind, this was Hong Kong, very different from the UK at the time in terms of having to get like a CIPD. So it's more experience driven in a company in Asia. So I wasn't too keen, admittedly, at the back of that. So I came back to London. I did my master's in business psychology, and I actually fell into recruitment. Because during my master's, I was only studying twice a week, so I needed to pay the bills. So I ended up falling into recruitment, which, yeah, lo and behold, working 10 years in a different environment. So I worked in a recruitment agency, I worked in startups, I worked in an SME. I worked in a corporate, Financial Times, which is my most recent role. And now currently I'm at Quantum Motion, which is a startup where I'm now come full circle. I'm now actually back into the people role again. So yeah, it's a really good question, because I think back to, 11 years ago, was that really what I want to pursue? I wasn't sure. I had planted the seed, but coming like full circle 10 years later, I realized, yeah, this is exactly where I wanted to be.
And it sounds like that's where you wanted to be from the start.
Yeah.
You just needed to get along the journey and to get there.
Yeah.
I can really resonate with that because I also studied criminology,
Yeah.
where I had the perspective of, okay, how can I take this degree?
Yeah.
I really like setting others up for success. I've been in sports my whole life. And then I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, which came with 7 more years of study. That also wasn't for me, just like what you were saying with psychology. And then lo and behold, I'm nearing on 10 years being in the people space myself. With your role that you're in currently, so you are head of talent and people, how would you describe what that actually means?
Yeah. So when I first started, so 3.5 years ago now, my title back then was actually head of talent and media. And I got a lot more question mark from my network going, what does that mean? So really it was employer brand. So it's talent employer brand. When I joined Quantum Motion, so context, we're a hardware company. We build quantum computing on a chip. So it's a very, very niche environment. And when I joined, we were 12 people. So the first 3 years, we were very much focused on hiring, building the team. And we're now just shy of 80 permanent staff plus 20 contractors. So about 100 all in all. And what's interesting is I think over time, because you build a relationship with the candidates as you're speaking to them, right? So as I mentioned, it's a very niche industry, niche market, and it takes a while to convert the candidates to become someone that's interested in even applying into your company. So you end up getting to know the candidates really well. And when you speak to them about their career development, what are they interested in? I always say in TA, talent acquisition and TA, your role never ends until the individual or the person actually completes the probation period. Because I think what happens when you work in an agency, there's always all right, once they're placed, see you later. Let me get the invoice out. But I think when you're internal, it's very much the quality of hire. Like, do they succeed? Do they go past probation period? How are they post onboarding? Because otherwise, if they don't succeed post onboarding, you have to go back to the drawing board and hire them again, right? So by nature, with that thinking, I've kind of now in reflection and hindsight, I've actually been thinking a lot about talent development because with that insight, you then share it with the managers and say, right, how is this person getting on? Are we ensuring that what we flagged during the interviews, we're actually giving the opportunity to shine, like during their time here? And another key thing here, and I think that's always overlooked, is actually during reference checks. When you speak to the previous managers, you ask them, how can we help this person grow and thrive in the next role? And we always use that intel to help them develop in their current role. So by default, what I didn't realize was I was doing talent development work already. So yeah, what does a role mean to me now? I think it's shifted because I now have a small team under me. I now have a recruiter that's taken off a lot of the recruiting off my plate, thankfully, because I think this time last year I was doing everything, but I felt like I was dropping the ball because I wasn't doing everything well enough. And I knew there was so much we had to do internally because we were growing, at an inflection point internally where our managers were going, hang on a minute, we actually need some support as well in terms of how to hire, how do we look at performance. So I think that's what the role means to me now. I still oversee the talent strategy on the talent acquisition side, but I don't do much on the day-to-day recruiting. And a lot of my role now is learning about the internal teams, how can we support them? And most importantly for me is now retention, because we spent the last 3 years on recruiting them. The next thing is actually how do we keep them?
Which goes back to the strategic advantage that talent acquisition brings compared with recruitment. Recruitment is much more, how do we hire? How do we get them through? The talent acquisition strategy is how do we have longevity with the candidates that we're bringing through, because candidates are becoming employees faster than ever at the moment. And I absolutely love that you mentioned we've got to keep momentum up to probation. A lot of people miss that.
I think so. And I think it depends on as well the size of the teams in the companies, right? I think in a larger company, I've worked in bigger companies before where sometimes there's a push and pull between TA and HR, where again, the TA's role ends once the person gets hired and it goes to HR for onboarding, right? Whereas I think in a smaller team, you have a lot more oversight because sometimes you actually need to do a lot of the onboarding tasks yourself. So I think once you start to see the whole 360 from onboarding and actually the employee experience and the journey with the company, you start to really engage with how they perform post-hire. So I really recommend bigger companies as well, to actually have a lot more, I suppose, not layover between TA and HR, but how do we collaborate more between both teams? Because ultimately TA and HR is one team.
Absolutely. In past roles that I've worked in, it was an overarching people function,
Yeah.
both TA and the people team. We were both under that function. Could we have collaborated better in hindsight? Yes, I think we could. But I also think this is quite a new relationship
Yeah.
for a lot of us, because previously we've had recruitment and it's completely different from talent acquisition.
Yeah.
And there's actually a statistic from LinkedIn data which shows that there's been a 23% increase in title and HR roles being combined together within the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And I think that's really eye-opening to the holistic approach and the more of a longevity, strategic initiatives we really need to take. And as you say, to form better relationships between the two.
Yeah. And I think that's where the future of the people teams are going towards, because there's so many different areas you can get into as well, right? You've got like people ops, you have systems. And I think with the traditional recruitment, as you say, and the future of TA, it's interesting because I think when I first joined Quantum Motion, my CEO said to me as well, he's seen so many recruiter CVs and it's all about times of hire, cost per hire. It's all very metrics driven, right? Whereas, and I think that's a good thing, because when you work in an agency, that's how you're thinking about placements and hires. But the future of TA, you're thinking about employer branding. You're thinking about how does it actually impact, the quality of hire. And there's so much you can get involved in from a TA perspective that I think a lot of classic recruitment teams forget. And go back to 2020 and actually 2023, I think the metric from layoffs.fyi, and they surveyed about 970 tech companies, about 220,000 people were laid off during post-pandemic era, I would say. And a lot of them were TA teams because, as you can imagine, the first things that come to a standstill are roles. And if all companies are cutting off roles, who's the first teams to be like, oh, is of course talent acquisition, right? And what you forget is there's so many different skill sets that a full 360 recruiter has, such as, sales, business development, because they need to be engaging with potential candidates, looking at data, looking at internal mobility options. So yeah, it's a bit reactive when you look at how companies reacted in those kind of scenarios, and really looking at the TA function overall. What other kind of internal skill sets do they have to then redeploy them into other areas within the people function?
And with those skills as well, they are incredibly valuable for the people function. If I think of my background and experience, yes, I studied criminology, but I did go down the traditional route. I went straight into a HR admin role. I studied CIPD. Whereas somebody who is in the TA space, who've got all of those skills that you've just mentioned, then moving over into the people space, they're bringing such a different perspective and value that the traditional people, similar to myself, we might not have.
Yeah.
And that's really valuable.
Yeah. It's an interesting one because on the other side, right, I have the imposter syndrome now because I didn't do the traditional CIPD routes. And when I go to a lot of people conferences, because the last 10 years I've been going to a lot of recruiting and TA conferences. And since I transitioned in my role, this was maybe about a year and a half ago now, I make a more active effort to now go and see, hey, what are other companies doing? What's the newest, thought leaders in this space and what are they doing? I really struggle sometimes. I'm like, oh my God, I don't have the CIPD. And someone in my team does. So I literally speak to her and be like, okay, what are you learning? But some other people I speak to in the space as well also say, I suppose, which is what I learned from more than 10 years ago now when I was working in the bank, is an experience versus theory, right? And because I work in a startup, I think luckily there's a lot of things as a company we're all learning together. So it kind of sometimes takes a back seat, but at most I think what I try to keep up to date with is, listening to thought leaders in the space. Like, I don't know if you know, like Julie, yes. And of course, Jesse Swan, like, having a specific philosophy. So I was so overwhelmed, I think in Q4 last year with, everything from like grievances, looking at updating our policies, and of course the new labor laws. There's a lot of different things to get stuck on. Very exciting time in the people world. But I'm like, well, where do I even begin? But I realized having a philosophy as like the people leader in the team will help you massively. So for me, is kind of defining one problem statement, prioritizing and taking it from there. Because otherwise you can get stuck on 100,000,001 things at the same time.
And it can be really overwhelming
Yeah.
at the same time. I completely agree. And I think it's really important that it's okay to not have the answers, but it's our responsibility to find those answers, whether that's in community groups, going to events, listening to podcasts like this one. This is how we can start to learn ourselves. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody else does. Let me know if someone does who's listening. But that way, we're all on a continuous learning journey. And there's such progression that we're seeing in the space at the moment. It's an absolutely exciting time to be in it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think hence the adopting a philosophy is a key thing, right? And so for me, like having now dealt with maybe a couple of exits in the last couple of months as well, it's like, okay, how do we deal with it with a human touch, right? And the analogy I always use is like going to a restaurant where maybe the food was so-so, actually maybe it was terrible, but the experience that the waiter gave you from actually just going in from the restaurant, how you checked in to all the way to how you got the bill, they actually treated you like, exceptionally well. You actually leave with a really good taste in your mouth. And I use that with my team. I'm like, we should treat everybody who comes in and out of the business the same way. So that's my philosophy, and I'm still kind of learning. But I think at the heart of the people role is actually just being present and listening to people as, they're venting about, their day. And sometimes I do find it tricky. I'll be, knee deep in annual reviews. I'm looking at metrics right now, and someone comes over and goes, "Can I have a word with you?" And you're kind of in flow right now. You're like, but you can't say no, right? So yeah, and I realize most of my days now when I'm in the office is just purely back-to-back meetings and just hearing the team out.
And no 2 days will be the same. Yeah, as well, is the biggest thing that I've learned being in the industry. It's tough, but it is really exciting. And I think with where you are, yes, okay, as you mentioned, head of talent and people, you've got support around you for the recruitment side. But what has been the most difficult challenge for you when bridging that gap?
Yeah. I think a few things. First, I would say in terms of the energy, before I kind of go into the day-to-day of the work, right? Like I am in a TA role, it is all about, it's very high energy, not that in a people role it isn't, but in a TA role, because you're speaking to candidates, you're on the forefront, you're on the ground, and you're getting everyone excited about the company and why you should join. And once they join, it's great, offer accepted, and everyone's happy because your whole role is to facilitate the candidate and the company, and they've got a new job. Versus, I think the biggest challenge I find coming into a people side is you're dealing with a lot of, maybe you're upholding policy, you are dealing with grievances, you're dealing with ER issues. So a lot of that is maybe less optimistic, maybe would be the best way to put it. And I had to shift gears, and it took me a while, admittedly, because I think as a TA person, you want to be upbeat all the time. And the people role, and I try to keep up with the same energy, but sometimes it's not actually the right energy to be met with in that space, right? So I think that was the hardest thing I found, firstly. Secondly, I think it's actually balancing the key priorities. So as I mentioned earlier as well, and there's so many different conflicting priorities whereby, for example, the most recent chunkiest projects I'm working with is annual reviews. This is our third year doing it. Admittedly, the first year we were much smaller, so it was a lot leaner. We moved a lot quicker. This year, we now have 3 years worth of data. So we're now looking at analytics. What's a year-on-year salary increase? What is the performance data telling us about each team? Actually, how are each managers rating each team as well? And there's so much you could dive into and then solve kind of one particular problem. But you can't, because you need to step out and zoom out and go, okay, but what is the key thing we're trying to solve here? So getting the team on board as well to run an engagement survey and understanding actually this team is actually the core team we need to look into first based on the data rather than trying to tackle everything. Because I think in TA, you could pretty much speak to 20 candidates at once and move them through the funnel. But in a people role, you can't do that. You just have to prioritize, I would say, 2 or 3 key initiatives and do it really well.
And there's so many stages as remaining part of the life cycle, which the HR and the people function pick up after TA got us through to that process. I completely agree. I think you've also got to balance your energy
Yeah.
when you're working in HR. No 2 days are the same.
Yeah.
You may be high energy, but then you may be faced with a restructure situation the next day. There's things
Exactly.
like that where you've got to still wear your human-centric hat, but also have your commercial hat on.
Exactly.
And that's hard.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another thing to add there as well, as an empath, because I learned a lot about myself in the process. As an empath, I realized I bring a lot of that energy home with me at the end of the day. So again, in TA, you're like, great, you hired X amount of people. I'm going to go home happy. And then in the people role, you're like, ooh, everyone's coming to you with something that day, and you take a lot of that home. So I've had to learn a lot about, how do I shake that off at the end of the day? What are the different things I need to do? So for me, as I walk home, luckily I'm not living on I live quite close to work, so I walk home, so I decompress. I do lots of meditations, but there's a key thing is, how do you not take that home with you at the end of the day?
I struggle with that.
Yeah,
I do struggle with that. I'm a people person.
yeah,
And I think a lot of us do. And the tips of walking home,
yeah,
when I was in corporate, didn't have that. I used to drive, and I'd try and distract myself with a
Yeah.
podcast, but then I'd find myself things like in the shower or before I go to bed, I'd
Yeah.
think about what was happening.
yeah,
Because as much as HR right now, which it's definitely a narrative being
Yeah.
driven that HR is there just for the company and don't trust them. I'm getting
Yeah.
a lot of comments
the
like,
LinkedIn,
LinkedIn,
yeah.
TikTok, is
Yeah.
full of it at the
Yeah.
moment. People don't realize that I'm awake thinking about a process and how you're feeling, and I am trying to advise and enable the business on the safest way and
100%.
most risk-free way.
Yeah,
And that does include
Yeah.
your impact within that.
100%.
And I still struggle with it. I think the biggest thing I found is exercise, very similar to you
Yeah.
with walking. I haven't tried meditation though.
Yeah, it's a weird one. So I was in Sydney because we opened offices in Sydney back in December or July. But December I was in Sydney, and I met someone there, and she works in kind of energy work, and she said to me, like, think about like shielding yourself. So when you go to work, like envision that you're shielding yourself. You're kind of shield on, and at the end of the day, the shield comes down. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. But I haven't visualized it to that extent. But
Yeah.
in a way, I think that's quite a metaphorical way to look at how you deal with these scenarios. So as an empath, you don't carry that emotions home with you. But yeah, I think that was definitely one of the hardest like challenges for me for the last quarter. Yeah.
And how have you found, now that you've got a team supporting you with recruitment, how have you found the people operations side?
Yeah. Yeah. So, one of the key things, as you know, because we were very busy hiring people the first 3
Yeah.
years, it was very scrappy. It was very much, right, what's the quickest way we can get them in? Of course, we had like contracts and offer letters and thinking about onboarding. And by the time we stepped back, we realized there was a lot of things missing as we were doing an audit, right? So also give you a bit of guidance as well. At the time, about 28% or 30% of our team on visas as well, which meant, again, we were very quickly trying to get everything like visas and then making sure everything is aligned so we were compliant to the Home Office regulations. But as soon as we stepped back, we realized there was a few things that were missing in everyone's profile. So I think Juby mentioned this really well. She called it the HR hierarchy of needs. And the bottom layer is essentially it's making sure your hygiene factors are all in place. So that's the very first thing that we did. We're like, okay, is everyone's contracts up to date? Is everyone's letter of variations up to date? Is their visas up to date? And actually, when we looked at the Home Office documentation, we needed to have like their monthly pay slips in our HRS. We needed to make sure we had the job descriptions in the ATS. There's a lot of things that we needed that at the time we were very scrappily hiring and didn't have in place. So the very first thing we did was to make sure everything's there. And then once that layer's complete, and admittedly, there's still a few things missing, but we know what's outstanding, so we can physically go and chase those individuals. The next layer is now thinking about how do you then drive it. So by driving, we mean what is a people strategy that you've defined for your team so that you can drive what's next. So for us, the drivers might be, ensuring we have a top tier talent EVP. So by the time we speak to candidates, they go, oh, Quantum Motion, that's a company we want to join. Not quite there yet, but how do we enable the drivers so that that is all in place? That's from a TA side, right? But from an HR side, on the people ops side, is like for us, it's a similar thing. How do we enable our internal experience for our employees so that they can go into the system and get everything they need via one click? Because even like looking at vacations, at the moment we're using two very different systems for it because of legacy. We're looking into it now, but looking at internal systems. And then the third layer, which we're not quite there yet, is looking at then how do you then scale, right? How do you then build and scale to, a forward-thinking talent function? So maybe you're a bigger company or you have deeper budgets, you'd be looking at how do you implement AI in your day-to-day, into your day-to-day HR stack, if you will. But I would say before you even get there, you really need to make sure your first layer, your base layer is operational and everything is working.
How
that takes time.
important and impactful was carrying out the audit for you?
Yeah, to be honest, very painful. So we do have employment lawyers to look at the visa side for us, but obviously on the people side, we did that ourselves. On top of that, we also have we have a few systems. So again, it's by nature, it was because as we started, we used a lot of third-party companies such as like payroll, and they helped us with our contracts. So as we were bringing that in-house, there was just a lot of things lying around in Dropbox or our HRS, and then also there was a third-party system with our legal partners as well. So it's really streamlining it. Like, why are we having to upload documents in 3 different systems when really we could just put it in one? But it was something you weren't really thinking about at the time because you were just doing it. And
that's when you're in that startup growth, scrappy, high energy. Like, I love that period of being into.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you're so tunnel vision and you're running, doing an audit is really beneficial because then you actually step back, you take a look, and it's like, right, okay, what hygiene factors do we actually have here, and what experience are we creating for our people in this moment, and is it one we're actually really proud of?
Exactly. And you learn a lot as well. Like when your employees, when your team members are messaging you the same exact questions, like, hey, where do I find access to the maternity policy, or where do I log in my vacation? You're like, okay, something's up here, right? So once you start gathering the data of like, what are the key questions, you can then start really thinking about, right, how do you then, maybe for us, we built a portal before even actually going into thinking about AI tools, because if we can just build a page where everything is accessible like an FAQ, then we can start thinking about how do we scale later on. But you need to start really taking stock of what are the key questions or the common questions that you get asked.
And also, the best ways in terms of implementing any strategy come from the voice of your people.
Yeah, 100%.
I wish I'd have known that at the start of my career. I thought I had to have all the answers and know everything.
Yeah.
But surveys, whether that's a full engagement survey or a pulse survey or feedback peer-to-peer, that's where I've found the most value of what people actually want. And then that builds the foundation of whether it is an FAQ guide, whether it's a guideline of how we do things here. They're really helpful.
Yeah, but I think that's back to the point. Like you said, HR is here to facilitate like the needs of the business. Yes, both from a leadership level, what's the I guess of a commercial strategy, if you will, but we are the voice of the people as well. So from what you hear back, where they're feedbacking back to leadership and say, well, this is what we're hearing. And to be honest, like, that's what we're hired to do, right? And that's why engagement comes in extremely handy, because we're like, well, if X amount of the team is telling us that they're not happy about, let's say, the open plan office because they can't hear themselves because they're trying to work, but we're not doing anything about it, then we should expect attrition, right? So it's a like for like that's what we're here to do. And hearing like getting feedback from the people is the most critical thing that we could do. But what do we then do with that information?
Such a key point. I actually think it's more damaging sometimes when people put surveys out there and then don't do anything about it. And you've got to be really intentional. Why are we doing this? And what are we going to do with the information afterwards? And how do we communicate that with our people?
Yeah. So we're in the process of doing this right now. And what was interesting is I think it was met with so much pushback from the managers, because very technical organization, they've come from academia. So they're like, I'm not sure. This sounds quite, corporate. I'm like, yeah, I mean, typically a lot of companies do this, but to explain to them like why this is critical. But exactly what you said is that we have to adapt it to our tone of voice and actually speak to the managers at a local level. Like, what do you think is important for you? And what we found is actually incorporating things like, are you happy with the way projects are run within the business? Are you happy with the way, because we're growing so quickly, we're across 4 different units now. Are you happy with the way how our desks are divided within the team? So actually going down to a local level to understand what the managers want, that way that could help us make more insights from there, I suppose. Yeah.
That also makes us better people partners because we're not just being reactive, we're really getting under the bonnet of what is happening and how can we also test what we're putting forward.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you, within your role now as head of talent and people, you're doing more of the people side and the people strategy than the TA side.
Yeah.
But if there's anybody listening who potentially they could be in that intersection of potentially, I'll give 2 scenarios. They're in recruitment and they're wanting to go into TA and they're like, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
Or they're in TA wanting to move over to the people space. What advice would you give to someone who's feeling a bit imbalanced at the moment?
I can imagine, and like I mentioned earlier, the example I gave during 2020 and then, fast forward to 2023 where there was a load of layoffs. I think that's what triggered my sense of, right, I don't feel very comfortable just in pure play TA role, because if our roles are first to go, what does that mean for us, right? So the advice I give is if you're let's say in an agency and you're in a pure play recruiter role and you want to go in-house. So the recruiter I hired in my team actually moved from agency to in-house. And she was an example. She was excellent because she was very narrow with the field. So she was leading the quantum desk at the last agency that she was at. And we actually interviewed about maybe 3 or 4 different recruiters for this role. And to be honest, I think a lot of them were excellent, but what made her stand out was the fact that she's been researching heavily in this field for the last year, which is a very novel field. And when you spoke to her, she already spoke the language. She's already like, oh, I've already researched candidates from this university, and we should be thinking about how we implement an EVP within looking into universities to look at grassroots level. You're like, oh, wow, like she already spoke our language. So I think that would be the first tip I would give for someone that works in agency who wants to work in-house.
Yes.
Really show that you're passionate about that particular company's sector and that you're already speaking the language. You already know where the candidates are. You already know how to source them, and you already know, you already hired them. I think that's the key thing. If you're going from TA in-house to a people role and you're working in maybe a bigger company or an SME or a bigger company, an example I give was in my time at the FT. So when I was at the FT, it was still 2020. My role was put on furlough for about 3 months, which also made me very nervous as well. But when I came back, I vowed that I would say yes to every project that came my way. And at the time, I was a recruiter, or I was heading up talent acquisition for product and technology. And they came and said to me, Christine, do you want to do some recruiting for the editorial team? I was like, I've never recruited for editorial or journalists before, but sure, I'll give it a go. Learned loads in the process. But on top of that, I also got involved with the L&D team, where I got to do training. And of course, with my experience and expertise being recruitment, not only doing recruitment training, but doing things like D&I training. And I've never facilitated before, right? And I learned a lot. And that maybe L&D could also be an interesting area to delve into during my time. So my advice, I think, for anyone that's in-house is try to collaborate. And we talked about this earlier on with HR teams, like learn about any projects that they're doing that you could like support them on, whether it's, like I mentioned earlier, in L&D and training. But I think the classic thing in HR is like onboarding, right? So like HR, I think once the role kind of gets handed over to HR, you assume like, okay, like that's it, my role's done. But you should absolutely be supporting HR on onboarding and feeding back, because you are the person that the candidate's speaking to. By nature, if there's anything you're hearing in the first month or the second month, the third month that they're not happy about, feed that back to HR and help to optimize that process.
My favorite question to ask during any onboarding process is, was there something that we promised you at the start that we haven't given you so far?
That's a good one. Yeah.
Because then we can start to see, is there something that we're missing during the initial attraction phase to then, as we're moving them into the onboarding, Are we disconnected? Are we just slightly off kilter? That's a real good eye opener that I found.
Yeah. Have you found anything interesting like during your time there?
The main ones that come back are around growth opportunities and
Yeah.
expectations. So
Yeah.
where we refined was around, we then got really clear on our first 30 days, what were the expectations within those first 30 days.
Yeah.
And that really helped employees to then see how they fit into the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And that's what they wanted to know.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a tricky one because you always like overlook that because you assume, okay, doing onboarding, we should explain what the company does and, where do they fit, right? And in the wider picture. But we always kind of bypass that because you're so stuck into like making sure they're be able to deliver and have everything that they need in week one. But actually just stepping back and saying, what do we do? What do the other teams do? And how does it all kind of fit into each other? Yeah, we're working on that as well.
And that's where collaboration really comes in. And we shouldn't be operating in silo anymore as an HR function. And I love that you're starting to pull on other functions as well. It makes us stronger.
Yeah.
And that's also where people then really see the value in us. If there are redundancy situations, we're not the first on the chopping block.
Agreed. And I think another one to add as well for the internal, like if you're working internally, systems is the most like obvious thing, right? And because you're working day to day with an ATS, if you're looking at, connecting the ATS with, I don't know, payroll or any other kind of tools that you're looking into, that already demonstrates that you're interested in operational and then looking at how things could be better and operational efficiency, I suppose, is the best way to put it. So a lot of that skills could be translated into HR. And by default, actually outside of HR. So another thing I suppose I also want to mention is I've definitely seen a lot of people in TA that's moved on to people, that's gone on and moved on to like COO roles and commercial director roles. So there's so many kind of different avenues that you can pursue.
And it's also giving people a lot of hope as well. And that's what I really want people to take away from this conversation, because you're absolutely right. We should be speaking the language. We should be saying yes to opportunities that will enrich us as professionals, whether that's collaborating in completely different functions and departments. It adds another string to our bow. And then the last point that you've mentioned around showing initiative, it's one of the best things that we can do in our careers.
Definitely. I think already doing the job already would definitely help. But there's so many different opportunities and projects that you can get stuck on, I think, on a day-to-day.
I love that. Sadly, I only have one more question for today. And I've loved talking about your journey and the vulnerability around it all. And I can really relate to a lot of things that you've said. Thinking about that now, if you were to reflect to where you were, university, getting your first job, what is one piece of advice that you would give your younger self?
Oh, wow. Probably actually the same journey that I took. I think back then I was so scared about everything, right? Because, market conditions and everything was kind of dictating whether I could get a job. And I was like, oh, I don't know whether I could do it. And it was only, I think, when I came back and did my master's and when I first fell into recruitment. Actually, back then, I did a thesis on how Goldman Sachs ran their leadership strategy. I actually messaged the guy that ran the entire leadership strategy on LinkedIn. I was like, hey, would you meet me for a coffee? And he said yes. And I remember walking into the lobby, and this was on Fleet Street, and just about to turn around and be like, I can't do this. Like, this is not me. And something just kind of took over. I was like, no, like whatever happens, right? This will just be a life learning experience. And I went in, interviewed him, actually got a pretty high score for that essay. And I remember he messaged me after. He's like, you're the first person to message me this year to ask me about how our leadership development program worked. He goes, just curious, like, what is your career trajectory? What do you want to do? And actually just hearing that from him just kind of ignited that, what, like, I could do this. So I think what I would have told my earlier self 3 years before then is just like, just don't be scared. Failure is just one thing, but you pick yourself up and you learn from it and you just keep going.
And it's how you respond from that
exactly.
failure as well. Everything in life is a lesson.
Yeah.
And that sounds an incredible conversation that you had at the same time.
I know. I could show you the paper if you want to.
Yeah, we should talk about this. Let's do it. Honestly, Christine, thank you so much for your time. This has been an incredible conversation.
Yeah,
thanks
great.
again.
Thank you.
Like this episode? Click here for more HR talk. And if you're just catching up, check out our previous episodes right here.